Like
Oh
it's
yeah.
just like there's. I once saw a talk by a guy Bruce Braun who does kind of like environmental philosophy in the kind of like the I don't know aesthetics or whatever,
Hmm.
and he was talking about and this is like back in 2007. I was doing my MA, and his argument was that the environmental movement is too kind of like rational in like oh we just present like the science of the facts just present the facts of the matter and then people will change their behavior in response to like the cognition of those rational facts. And it's like we have to look at like experience. And it's like and he was talking about the pleasure of driving, right? The pleasure of
Yeah.
driving a car, not
Yeah.
not when you're stuck in traffic outside of but
On a
like
windy mountain
but, yeah,
road.
the wine, yeah, like the pleasure that's invoked by car commercials, exactly,
Yeah.
right? And I think like that's absolutely like I think that's a really great point.
Well, it's
'Cause
about
like
imaginaries. I mean, the
Mm.
car commercial invokes an imaginary. Like, I mean, in India, I was talking to my students about this last week. In India, the commercials were about driving up a stream, on a stream bed. Right? It's
uh,
completely insane if you think about
Right.
it.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
they would show people driving up, which
Well, yeah,
they don't
and
even, that doesn't even exist except for probably in a few states where you could do that. And
Yes.
yet, then you hear about some problems where people are driving their four-wheel drive off-roading in India, like, and Range
yeah,
Rovers and stuff like that. So a lot of the middle class in India aspires to do this, right?
yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes you'll see insane
What
things on Indian streets where someone who just lets loose this vehicle, and it's like, what's
it's
happened to this person,
it's
right?
but that
Right.
happens in like even like North American
Oh
car
yeah,
commercials,
Yeah.
and it's like I will watch these like truck commercials, and I'm like, oh my god, you're driving through like prime like salmon bearing,
yeah.
like those are salmon bearing streams you're 4x4 in through.
Yeah, and
Eh,
it's this
It's like
notion of like freedom and also domination. There's all kinds of implicit tropes there, I think, about
totally,
our relation to nature and
yeah, it's
machismo as well. Like, yeah,
Totally.
to-
I mean, I
yeah,
was 16 when I had a car, right? That's like
yeah, me
why I
too.
couldn't vote. I couldn't,
Me too.
I couldn't drink. I couldn't do anything in any province legally, right? But I
Yeah,
could drive 1 ton vehicle and potentially like mow down people or whatever, right? Like
yeah,
without
yeah,
knowing or hit and run. But I mean, I think that kind of responsibility says something about North American automobility, right? And then it becomes the role model for the rest of the globe. I mean, I became really fascinated with automobility. To me, that's actually an ultimate. I know that's what we want to talk about
so
is more climate
what
justice, but it's mobility's justice and climate justice are really closely linked, actually. Yeah.
100%.
yes.
So I just want to ask, are we recording?
I just started recording, so
Okay,
we're
Ah,
recording.
okay,
So
great.
this could be an, what do they call that? Like a cold
Soft
open or
intro.
something,
So
soft
this is
intro.
a soft intro. So, welcome to David Sadoway, our special guest for this episode of Green Justice, the Green Justice Podcast.
Yes, that is
Okay.
the name.
And with that interjection, I'll allow the conversation to continue. Automobilities.
Right,
And
and you are Mark Vardy.
I am Mark Vardy.
I am Greg Simmons. Our co-host Paula Hirschman sadly can't be with us this week, but will
She's
be
teaching.
joining us
She's
for
teaching.
future
She has a good
episodes.
excuse for not being here.
I
So we'll
guess.
let her off the hook this time. But, you
Yes,
know.
but we're thrilled to be with David Sadoway, who's going to talk to us about, whatever it feels like, climate justice, environmental justice, ecological justice, also maybe perhaps engaging students in those issues, because I know you do a lot in that area, David. So, yeah, maybe on that issue, maybe on the first issue, could you tell us how you conceptualize justice in either an environmental or an ecological way? To start with kind of a bigger picture question, what does that mean? I guess that is a very big picture question. But
Mhm.
if you have thoughts on the
Well,
issue in
I
general.
like throwing it out to my students, right?
Right.
In fact, in my class, my introduction to the climate crisis class, which I started teaching this semester just on Thursdays, last Thursday, I asked them that very question because it's been coming up as, part of what we're supposed to be looking at in the course. And I remember just asking it as an open-ended question, but then eventually actually drawing the scales of justice, right?
Right.
And I think that just that very useful term, the scales of justice, right? Like Nancy Fraser talks about that as well in her work. And that idea that scales of justice could be scale, like is it fair? How does it balance in the scale? But it could also be a geographic sense because I'm coming at it from a geographical perspective. So what scale are you talking about, right? And I think when I threw it back to the students, I was trying to understand how did they perceive justice, right? And
Mm.
a lot of the kinds of things that I would say are quite similar, right? So the students were talking about fairness, equity, those kinds of things. The word equity kept coming up, right?
Right.
And I think that those kinds of things, how do they manifest in a practical way in terms of climate, right? So that's part of, I guess, the way I frame it myself. Scalar justice, right? I mean, if I think about the most basic, I like to think of it in terms of stories too. Like
Mm.
the one of the places where I really became interested in understanding climate from not just my local scale, but from a global scale, because it is to me, it's a collective action problem, right?
The ultimate one.
Yeah, it's the
Yes.
ultimate collective
Yeah.
action problem. Whether, I mean, when we often use other collective action problems as examples, right? Like resolve, the success story of resolving the Montreal Protocol,
Mhm.
resolving the situation with the ozone layer, right? With ozone depleting chemicals. That's a good example of how the global community, so-called global community came through with multilateral mechanisms, whether it was the UN or the work that was being done bilaterally and then multilaterally. And that was a way to solve a collective action problem. So how can that translate as, with the climate emergency? I go back to stories. So I go back to when I went to a conference in, I think it was 2010, when I was doing my PhD in Hong Kong at the time. And I went with a group from Hong Kong, and it was the pre-conference was for planners. The actual conference itself was Habitat, United Nations Habitat, and then there was a component on climate, climate in cities. And at the pre-conference, I met a group of really interesting guys. We were getting in a van, and there wasn't much room in the van because there was these big guys, and they were South Pacific guys, right?
Right.
From, I don't know, remember all the islands, but that's like Samoa and Fiji and Tonga and Vanuatu and stuff. And they were saying, Dave, like, you got to tell people our story, right? And their story was what's happening to their islands.
Right.
And that's basically what they were doing, was they were going around simply saying, like, our communities, our countries might not exist in, 50 to 100 years because those small island nation states, the sea level is rising such that, the waters will inundate most of the habitable areas.
Yeah.
and or where their fresh drinking water is, right? And so it's impossible to live where your community or your house or your land or your water supply is under salt water. And
Right.
so I think those stories, when I talk to students about those things, that really makes them aware of both climate justice, but I like to use the bracketed in before justice. So
Right.
to me, it's a dual, like, understand the injustice before we start talking about justice, because justice often implies a nominal or ideal solution
Right. Right.
or solutions. Yeah.
Right. And so it's a story that conveys this notion of justice, of course, because as we often see, the people suffering the effects of climate change the most are the ones that often had the least to do with creating the problem in the first place, right? In the developing world and so on. So there's when you talk about equity, and that to me like takes this issue of equity and makes it very real for people, right?
Especially the small island nation states, right? Because
Yes.
these are not historically emitting countries, right?
Exactly,
They're
right.
mostly fishing communities living relatively traditional. Like, okay, now it's tourism, so they're getting, some of them are getting air traffic, and that is more problematic in terms of long distance travel. But the communities themselves were not responsible for the global emissions. We know that, we have the data on that, right? So it's a very clear and egregious example of how what we do in BC or Alberta is having a direct impact on communities in the in so-called global south, right?
Right.
I think
Yeah.
it's also a great example of how climate change is not like just a scientific issue. I mean,
Mm.
oftentimes you hear about climate change in context of the science, but a story around the impact on small island states in the Pacific or South Pacific. Yeah, this is their homeland, right? This is where they live. This is their entire existence, and
Yeah.
that's why I have heard similar stories being expressed where they say this is why climate change is an existential threat, right? And they mean that literally. It's an
To
existential
our
threat
existence.
to their existent
Yeah.
ways of life, ways of being, and I think that then really is a way of sort of personalizing it because with a little bit of sociological imagination, maybe we can start thinking, well, what would happen if our own
Yeah.
homes were threatened
They
on
are
that
us. We
kind
have
of
to
scale?
move it
Yeah.
from they being us, right?
Yeah.
Fellow humans
Right.
in the shared, biosphere, ecosphere, Earth system, Mother Earth, whatever you want to call it, move beyond our tribal or regional or, state defined entities to see that, hey, these are fellow humans, right? I
Mhm.
mean, I think there's some irony. We were talking before about, how automobility is seen as a rite of passage in North America. Often I find that in North America, at least the media tends to focus more on polar bears, which is good and important and iconic. It's charismatic megafauna,
Mhm.
but we can't imagine the existence of someone in a small island state. Like it's easier for people to feel sympathy, perhaps in Canada, for a polar bear when we should actually be feeling sympathy as well for people, whether it's in Bangladesh who are in flood zones, right?
Mhm.
But I mean, maybe we need to look at it that it's also like these people's future is like that of the polar bear. I mean, we look at an emaciated polar bear trying to find solid ice, and whereas climate is impacting the global north as well, right?
Mhm.
Especially the
Yeah.
high
Especially
Arctic,
so,
right? And
yeah.
that's affecting. There's another injustice that's affecting mostly Indigenous people, as well as all of the ecosystems in which they're dependent, right? Their
For
traditional
sure.
livelihood,
Yeah.
whether it's polar bears or caribou or
Yeah. I
or
mean,
fisheries.
there's, I remember a statistic from several years ago now, but it was about the amount of protein that is consumed in Nunavut that comes from what they call country food, right? Or
Mhm.
hunted food. And I think it was like 85%. Like,
Mm.
I'm going to have to double check this
But it's
after,
high, yeah.
but it was like, there was a significant part of the diet, which comes from food that has been hunted. And
Yeah,
all of that food, a lot of it comes from the, um, the edge of the sea ice, right? Because
yeah,
like the edge of the sea ice is this incredibly biodiverse or
nutrient
it's
rich.
yeah, it's a
Yeah.
very productive zone, right? And so yeah, I have heard people sort of almost complain about the images of the emaciated polar bears as being like the symbol of a changing Arctic when there's so many dramatic impacts on people and societies up there.
Yeah.
And you think about okay, like permafrost degradation and what that does to airports, right? And so just ways of life are changing in
Yeah.
profound ways.
So I think those justice issues to me come back to before climate injustice, it's about social justice, it's about ecological justice,
Right.
it's about economic justice, right? So socioeconomic and environmental. I always ask my students to see, right? I use that acronym, right? See, right? Socioeconomic and environmental injustices. To think when you're analyzing these things because they're interlinked. And so a
Mhm.
lot of that, even before our knowledge of climate change became more magnified. You were talking earlier in a conversation about the IPCC. Before science sort of brought us that full awareness, at least is at a social level or societal level, and especially in universities and colleges. I think that there was always an awareness. Whether people actualize this is another thing, but there was always some awareness that there's imbalances in society, there's injustices, right?
Yeah.
And I always say to my students, well, it's linked, right? Social and economic and environmental injustices are all interlinked. I mean, ergo, that's the term sustainability, because sustainability became about how do we link environmental injustices or inequalities and think about, how does that balance with economic and social. And so those injustices, often when you start talking about climate injustice, it becomes, oh, this is increasingly complex. These are even in some ways wicked problems, because pre-existing injustices, right? Those communities we're talking about often have been marginalized in other ways, right? Whether it's in the global north, having no say in what's happening, or little less say in terms of what's happening on the land, right? Now, one could argue Nunavut has more, territorial governance, self-governance, but historically, those communities were marginalized, as we know, around the world, Indigenous communities or the global south, right? So there always those questions come into the justice play, right? Like if you're even in wealthier societies, if we look at how climate will manifest itself, if you're relatively wealthy, I mean, to simplify, you could take off in your private jet, or you could always move around in your automobile. We've got the infrastructure in place. But if you are less affluent in that society, we know the research says that those people will be more vulnerable, right? Look at the heat dome in Vancouver. Suddenly it came home to people, right? We are not talking about the high Arctic, where some people may never go in their lives, or Micronesia. We're talking about in Metro Vancouver. And Human Rights Watch did a report after the heat dome, the so-called heat dome, where a lot of people died in their own apartments because they didn't have cooling, because they couldn't get an ambulance on the phone, and those systems broke down. And a lot of those people were more financially vulnerable, right? So that's another example of the scalar aspects of climate justice, right?
Yes.
It could be happening in our own community, and we might not even see it or be aware of it, because we don't walk in those circles, or we don't open our eyes about what's happening within our communities.
Right. And there is, I think, at one point when people were assessing climate and environmental risk, there was this hope, I think, perhaps, that the global nature of it would induce a kind of shared, responsibility, because it was felt that, well, we're all at risk, right? And in a sense, we are all at risk. But the reality is, like you're saying, that risk is not distributed equally. It intersects with these other social, socioeconomic factors. Class, of course, is huge, but also race, gender, these different variables, right? So people do not experience this, are not at the same risk from climate change.
And it takes those visceral, sometimes it's just horrible to say, but it takes, I mean, I've heard people say this for years, right? It's going to take a horrible shock before we become aware of it, because we get jolted, right? As much as, all of us, we're teaching about climate justice in different ways, or talking about it in different ways. As much as we could hope that, hey, like my cousin's work in the oil patch, it's like, what's it going to take? Like, I can tell them stories about small island states. They might even experience some of the stuff themselves. But is it going to take forest fire, like Fort McMurray style forest fires, and changes in the forest regime and the fire regime, which we know, right? Is it going to take that year after year before people finally get it? And I'm not seeing that. Like, I'm not seeing people necessarally get it, right?
In fact, they can go the other way. They can become more reactionary,
more self-interested, right?
Yeah.
So you see, like the rise. I mean, 'cause there's a
anti-immigration.
kind of like a lifeboat mentality, right?
Yeah.
Like or a fortress mentality. Where like, okay, climate change is going to just make everything more precarious. I got to look after my own.
Take care, get the safe room, get your weaponized, securitized,
the survivalist kind of mentality.
So that's what we try to teach, right? We need to teach that is part of the phenomena, right? Because that's what we know, right? That seems to be what is happening. And when we look at policies, when we look at the policy cycle, when we look at political ideologies, we need to explain that, right, to our students. And that's what the data show us on migration, right? Like, increasingly we're getting climate migration. But why, at the same token, there's a disconnect. The response of typical response of right-wing governments is to build more walls, right? And so there's a disconnect, right? So I do think, though, that those local events do make more people aware, right? You're not hearing the kind of climate skepticism that you did hear a decade ago, or 15 years ago, or 20 years ago. So, and did it take all of these fires in BC? Did it take a heat dome in BC? did it take I mean, I was trapped in the interior when the flooding happened, right? Remember the summer after the summer. I mean, was that 2021? I can't even
Yeah,
remember,
like
2020.
November, like the floods, and I think it was
I
November
was on the
2021.
road driving back from Kelowna. It was insane.
Yeah. But the irony is that year, that was the summer of when Lytton burned down.
Mhm.
That's when we had the heat dome in Vancouver, where 600 or more people died in mostly in their buildings. And then that fall, we had this calamitous flood, right?
Yeah.
This atmospheric river,
Mhm.
series of atmospheric rivers, a series of days of very intense rainfall. And so the Sumas River, there was the flooding, the Nooksack River, the Sumas
Yeah.
River, the dikes held in some places and they didn't in others. And so we had, the Sumas Prairie, which was, arguably perhaps, they didn't really follow Indigenous knowledge systems there, right?
Yeah.
They just sort of went ahead and made this agricultural land, right? And
Because it was originally a lake.
it was
lake,
originally a
yeah.
lake,
And
and
then
it
they-
was rich in fisheries and so on and so forth, right? And ephemeral, like it was more of a design with nature the way it was working. But in any case, that area flooded, and so the access to the Lower Mainland. I mean, I was in the interior with some friends. We were just taking like a long weekend kind of trip, and we got trapped. We were supposed to be staying in Salmon Arm, and for the evening, and then we had to divert. We got held back in Revelstoke. I met someone in Revelstoke who told me, in the morning, his arm was in a cast or in a sling or something, and he said that a rock went down. He was near Three Valley Gap on the Trans-Canada, and a rock came down and went in through his windshield, and he
Yeah.
injured his arm, right? And
Yeah.
again, stories.
Yeah.
I think these kind of stories, actually, a lot of people, they don't get their stories from science. Science is there in the background, right? And if the story matches the science, then people begin maybe to look at things differently,
Connect the
right?
dots.
But those kind of stories of people who were trapped, who couldn't get in, like then we relocated to Kamloops because we thought, well, okay, Crow's Nest Highway was closed, Trans-Canada Highway was closed, Coquihalla Highway was closed, right? Number 3, number 5, and number 1. So then we thought, well, maybe we can get over on the 99 going via, Cache Creek and up through Pemberton and down to Whistler and down to Vancouver. Then that highway became closed. But we were in Kamloops when we found that out. So we were just sort of watching these reports. Then we found out that Merritt was filling up because it was flooding, but the sewage plant broke down. So it was filling up with sewage, right? But if we're talking about climate justice, we need to begin to analyze these things in situ, in the moment. Well, who is more vulnerable? The people who lived in the floodplains, maybe they weren't supposed to be living in the floodplains, or, cheaper property. So usually people who are less affluent, materially affluent, lived in the floodplains. So right away, there's climate injustice. Indigenous communities were being impacted as well. And we've seen this, seen this with the fires. The first reporting tends to ignore Indigenous communities for all of the injustice reasons, right? They're not part of the networks. They're, et cetera, et cetera. And so we often don't get first line reporting, right? Yeah. But then the other story that I wanted to say was, we were in the hotel in Kamloops deciding whether, how we could go back. We had a rental car. The rental car agency wasn't sympathetic at all. They were like, oh, you need to return it by this day. It's like, there's no way to get back to Vancouver except for the States, and we don't have our passports, right?
Yeah.
So I think they made some arrangement where you could just use your driver's license for this emergency or something. But so our friend decided to go back. So we had the privilege to be able to fly back. One of us had to fly back for work almost immediately. The others were working later on. So that was it was my non-teaching semester. So I could have taken my time too. But then I went to the grocery store when I was in Kamloops. Grocery store, there was a run on food. So then it makes you think again about climate injustice. When the rubber hits the road, who's going to get the food? The people who can make the time, who can drive in, who can use their credit card, they can buy up the food, et cetera, right? So, and then we were in this hotel, and I was like, well, maybe we should get out of here because people from Merritt are really going to need this because they're out of their homes. We still have homes in the Lower Mainland, right? So when you're actually in an emergency, if you can coolly think out these things in a justice framework, most people don't have time, right? They're worried about their kids, their dogs, whatever, their house. But we actually need to deconstruct some of these incidents, right? And I think that everything's moving so much faster. So then it becomes like the fog of war. And this is my concern, is that we're just going to, we could be going over the cliff. Many argue that we're already in that state. And the solutions are maybe clear to those of us who study these things, but it becomes like the fog of war. So then it becomes, what is factual, what is truthful,
Yeah.
what is legitimate, what are the right directions to go, right? So then it becomes, and then you can get demagogues coming in and saying, no, this is not
the
nothing to
strong
do with
man.
climate, et cetera, right? So I
Yeah.
think getting our students to think clearly about these situations, learning about disasters, learning about the causes and effects of climate change, and then articulating solutions that work, which we can talk about later, I guess. But I think just understanding how to make sense, or to sense make in the sort of fog of war, is really important, right? And if the war is this sort of war on the earth, in terms of
Right.
climate change, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, when you're talking about the fog of war, I'm thinking about like crisis, right? So we hear all the time language now about the climate emergency and the climate crisis, which kind of implies this series of cascading events where we emerge battered from one situation like the heat dome, and then before we know it, we're into this flooding event, and then like it's very possible to conceive of a time in which it's just kind of we're just getting battered from all sides, right? On
Yeah.
on various fronts. And I think part of the nature of climate change that is now being more widely recognized is that it's nonlinear, which means that surprises are more likely to happen.
Yeah.
Right. And so it, there used to be this idea that, oh, we can kind of forecast, or we can kind of predict when and where climate events are going to occur. And we can, to some degree, plan for those people and those communities and those species who are in the path of impending climate impact.
Mhm.
But I think there's been a bit of a paradigm shift in maybe like the last, I don't know, 15 years or something, where it's like, okay, climate change happens in unanticipated ways. Like the Earth system itself and our interactions with it mean that there's, the baselines have shifted sufficiently so that we can't predict with certainty, right? Like how climate change impacts are going to manifest.
Yeah.
Right. And so
More stochastic.
this goes
Yeah.
back to the point we were talking about earlier around climate justice and needing to look at people's where they're situated in terms of the economy and social and cultural political issues.
Yeah.
Because you need to address vulnerability at its root.
Yeah.
Right? For everybody, not just those who we think are going to be impacted by climate, because we don't know yet.
Absolutely.
Where those
Right.
impacts are going to manifest.
Right.
And the other thing I wanted to say, one more thing,
I agree.
another part of this whole story around the flooding, and I was thinking about this when you're describing the rock that came off the cliff and through the windshield of the car and smashed the
Or
guy's arm.
down the hill. I'm
Yeah.
not sure if it came off a cliff or down a hill or whatever, but
But
it had impact.
one of the things that I remember Greg talking about was the impact of like logging practices, right? Because we know that when
Right.
forests have been decimated,
Yeah. Steep slopes,
steep slopes,
clear cuts.
then yeah, exactly. Then they are more susceptible to flooding because
Yep.
they don't have the ecosystems to like hold soil in place.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
So
I mean,
this
that's quite clear, right? With firescapes. I mean, that's the other one where to me it's like very tangible, right? Take a drive to the interior. I mean, part of my travels to the interior usually involves, I don't own a car, but I rent a car now and then, and I'll rent a car and go visit my family in the Okanagan. And previous summers I've seen like fires right beside the highway, right?
Yeah.
Right along the Coquihalla. My dad was relocated. I'm sure that he got stressed out. But it's how do you measure these things? Like how it impacts a life, right? My aunt told me, my aunt who since passed away actually of cancer, but like my aunt has told me what it was like with my dad relocating to her place, right? He was moving from Armstrong to Vernon. And that's very stressful for older people to potentially think that you can lose your home, right?
Mhm.
And that's, these are middle-class Canadians. I mean, as much as we might not want to look at this, we're relatively privileged. We have systems in place. But what about people like look at the floods in Pakistan, right? how that displaced so many people, right?
Yeah.
Just a couple of years ago. And these kinds of situations, I mean, right now there's fires in Chile, right? So we can talk about the massive fires in Australia, right? Pick any extreme climate event. And, historically these have always occurred, but as you say, like the complexity, the non-linearity, the order of magnitude of variability, and the shifts in, we know that the science is quite unambiguous on this, right? So we both have to mitigate and adapt to the situation, right? And a lot of times I'll talk to my students just about those two things, right? I'll always be like, I love acronyms. This is the MA, right? Like think of your mother, think of your Mother Earth or your own mother. Like what are you going to do in this situation? Because it's that important, right? It is that important in both in an existential way and for our own fates, our own shared fates, right? So one way to address it is to think of those two, right? It's maybe overly simplifying, but think of mitigation as reducing greenhouse gases, and adaptation is how are we going to adapt our cities, our communities, our neighborhoods, our provinces, our regions, our countries, our globe? How are we going to adapt to this reality, right? Because we know it's happening, and that's kind of the disaster management piece. But I think the mitigation is the harder one for a lot of people, right? Because that means we've got to change our lifestyles, whether it's automobility in North America, this idea that, by the time you're 16, you should have the right to drive, and the constant justification we hear that, oh, we need to be able to drive because we've got all these spaces and, we're just used to it. We have all this wonderful infrastructure, but that infrastructure's come at a price. Our cities over 100 years ago were actually in many ways more electrified than they are now in terms of their transit systems, right? We had electric streetcars, we had the interurbans, right? Look at lower mainland in Vancouver, like this area. You could take an interurban to Steveston. You could take an interurban 99 kilometers from Scott Road all the way to Chilliwack.
Yeah.
You could take electric streetcars in New Westminster, where I'm living on Kakite territories today, right? So, and cities all over North America had these systems in place, right?
Yeah.
So they electrified transit systems, right? In Vancouver, it was done through hydro. So, we need to actually look back to the past a little bit and try to understand how is it that automobility, because I focus on automobility a lot because that's 30% often, 25 to 30%, about a third of our urban footprint is from transportation. And the majority of that is private automobility. And I think the solutions that a lot of people are articulating is that, oh, we just need to electrify our cars. There's a lot of injustices in that solution as well, right? So having a climate justice framework is a really powerful thing for helping us think about the mitigation piece as well as the adaptation piece.
Yeah. And a lot of that shift actually from the electrified public transit oriented system to a car, to automobility, was actually like conspiratorially driven by the auto manufacturers, tire manufacturers, rubber manufacturers, and of course big oil, where they actually bought up
Sure, it was in a lot of people's
systems.
interests, right?
Yeah.
It depends on the
Dismantled.
context too. Like
Yeah.
look at Los Angeles Basin. They
Los
used to have
Angeles is a good
small
example.
communities interconnected, and then it became in the oil industries and the tire industries and the real estate developers' interests to have sort of sprawl, right? And
Yeah.
so how do we move away from that kind of morphology? So that's what I try to do in my urban planning courses.
Right.
Get students to think of different morphologies, right? Like, just as if we would think of our body as a morphological system with a metabolism. How do we get our students to think of different alternative ways, like more compact communities, more transit oriented communities, to make places, right? So I always say to students that, housing solutions could also be thought of as climate solutions.
Right.
Mobility solutions can be thought of as climate solutions, food system solutions. So my course last summer taught here at Civic Plaza, on this campus of KPU, we got students to look at redesigning the city for climate justice, right? And we looked at those three areas: mobility solutions, food solutions, and housing solutions, right? I mean, these are arguably the biggest three problems that we have in the country. I mean, other people would say, well, drug issues are big, and each person would have their own. But from an urban planning perspective, I see those three as really common across the Canadian Federation, right?
Right.
And in many cities in the globe. And again, it goes back to climate justice, right? I have a picture of people. I like taking pictures from a distance of people's precariousness, not from a tourist perspective, like where I'm just gawking at this, but to actually show to my students, like there are people, I have a picture of people living under a bridge in Italy. It's actually quite ingenious because it's covered, it's a good bridge, solid bridge, so they're out of the rain. But if the river were to flood, they would be out of a home, right? So they're already precarious. So that's like, it's a great example of climate injustice because they're already experiencing social injustice, and now they can be experiencing potentially flooding and climate injustice, right? So it's also, some climate scholars like Robin Lachenko and Karen O'Brien call that double exposure problem.
Right.
They're already exposed to socioeconomic factors. You add another exposure, an environmental or climate related exposure, it's like you're doubly at risk, right? It's like if you don't have a vaccine, you could be more at risk to one thing, and then they can have a knock-on effect and make you more vulnerable to something else, right?
Right.
So let's talk about solutions. What I'm curious, like in this course, what kinds of solutions come from students? What kinds of ideas do you see bubbling up? Not just in that course, but from the students that you engage with, throughout all the various activities that you're
Yes.
involved in here at KPU.
Yeah, well, and that's what this is all about, right? I always, when I start to lose hope, I just start thinking about my students because they know the solutions. They're either innate or they're part of their sort of crowdsourcing of ideas, right? So I think it's important to hand the mic over to students and get them to articulate, right? So I like getting them into little. I have these. I got these little whiteboards, right? And I get them to do workstations and then to come up with articulate solutions for any number of things, right? Like we in my climate change class, we look at energy a lot, right? So we look at an MIT model. They play with it on their laptop where they're trying to lower the curve. In this case, it's lowering the carbon curve, right? The CO2 emissions curve. And what are some wedges that you can do to lower it? So being a wedge being sort of a policy realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's also based on an exercise out of Princeton that they use as well. So basically they learn that by playing with the levers of policy, so they, by doing this almost as a gamified version, right? It's a serious game, but almost a kind of fun way to think about policy. It's like, oh, if you increase carbon tax, this is what can happen with lowering the curve of emissions and therefore lowering the global temperature, getting it back to one, ideally we want to get it under where it's at right now at 1.1, 1.2, and we want to get it back down again, right? But we're on course for getting it, the global temperature is going to be 1.5. So I keep challenging my students, here's a basket, a menu of policy options, and look at those, right? Then I get them to focus more in the classes because those are they're learning the parameters, right? They're learning what the levers are. Everything has trade-offs, right? Oh, if you're going to institute a quick and dirty fix, is it really as easy? Is this a silver bullet, right, to electrify cars? Have you thought about what that means? Like, why would you electrify cars or subsidize electrified cars when you're not subsidizing electrified transit? That's a perfect justice question, right? Because car drivers tend to be more middle class and upper middle class, and especially those who can afford a $60,000 electric car, they're going to lobby the government more, and they're going to feel like, it's not that people set out to say, oh, I want to put these other people in a worse off situation. They're just talking about their reality and their own privilege, right? So I think getting my students to look at solutions in terms of that complexity, in terms of what are the socioeconomic and environmental impacts, is one way to do that. Prompting, pushing them to think about those questions, and then think about those solutions. So I'm just trying to. I wish I could share with you on my camera. Like I always take pictures of their little whiteboards afterwards, right? And there's just a whole range of things. I always like to characterize it as, policy solutions could be regulatory, they could be incentives or disincentives, or it could be education, right? Like just in a simplified, trichotomy of ways. So a lot of times students will come up with things like quite radical, actually. Like we had a speaker come in and talk about the Sue Big Oil campaign, right, from West Coast Environmental Law. And so some of the students came up with that as a solution, right? We should sue big oil, right? And we didn't have time to sort of deconstruct, well, what would that involve? Who would do that, right? So it gives them a kind of reality check on the policy cycle, but it also makes them think that, hey, it's not just, the answer is not just one thing. It might need to be a multiplicity of things,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I mean,
great.
I think it's fantastic to engage students at that level. The challenge, as I always see it, is there's so many. Like we have solutions, right? There's so many possible solutions. The challenge is implementing them,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Which is, again, it goes to this, the fact that these problems are so socially located. I mean, we live in this global capitalist economy that's premised on exponential growth,
Yeah.
which means there's a doubling time.
Treadmill of consumption.
Yeah, like 20 years from now, the economy will be double its size, right? Barring an economic collapse or a dramatic shift in the nature of the economy. Can we, through like policy, I guess is different because policy you can, like if there's the democratic will and the political will, you can.
And policy
kinda
can be talked
implement.
about at scale as well.
Yes, yeah. But in general, can we, through better technology and better policy, overcome that fundamental dynamic? That's the challenge, I think. I don't know what do you think about that? Like do we need a bigger shift of some kind to a different kind of economy?
I think the key comes to the analysis. Like if students
Yeah.
can see the problems as being multifaceted, then I suggest to them that, and I give them examples as well, that an analysis that shows the complexity in a problem can then potentially be a remedy in terms of a solution, because the solution would also have to be equally complex, right? So if they are looking at something with a double exposure framework, where you see that a climate problem isn't just the refugees are not just the part of the climate problem, a cause of the climate problem. There is also deeper socioeconomic and other issues, right? Environmental refugees or other kinds of issues. So a housing problem is not just a housing problem. It can also be seen as a climate mitigation and adaptation issue as well, right? Is the housing located in a safe space in terms of future climate change? Is it, cooling? Are there accessibility to cooling centers, or is it designed as a passively cool place? But is it also giving co-benefits? Like, is it actually producing less greenhouse gases? Is it a zero energy house? Does it have, I don't know, all the bells and whistles in terms of, whatever the latest building technologies? Does it have heat pumps? Does it have solar? Can it go off grid, et cetera, right? So some of the solutions need to be looked at through multiple lenses. I also go back to, when you look at what's happening on the ground in Canada, to me, some of the most innovative, both climate just and also culturally just solutions are coming from Indigenous communities, right? And we hear them. I mean, we're hearing them in the media, right? Like whether it's wind farms in Mi'kma'ki, the Mi'kmaq communities, or whether it's solar on Vancouver Island in Indigenous communities there, and you think, well, Vancouver Island, solar, right? But it's happening. And so those, communities, Indigenous communities are really taking the ball, and, not all Indigenous communities, but because it's not a monolith, but some Indigenous communities are really demonstrating to me how they're doing something that's suited to the local needs of their communities, that it's actually providing some jobs, right? I'm not of the opinion that all climate solutions need to be job creating or, in economy enhancing. But, that current economy that you described, we do need, and part of justice then is a transition, right?
Yeah.
The so-called just transition. So justice isn't just about unjust impacts. It isn't just about solutions, but it's also about transformations and transitions, right? So if people are going to lose jobs where they had jobs, whether it's in Jharkhand in India, right? So I a few years ago, I invited Sandeep Pai and Savannah Carr-Wilson, who co-authored a book. I thought it would really be of interest to my students because Savannah comes from Canada and she's interested in environmental law, and she met Sandeep at a university program. I think at the time it was in Budapest, Central European University. And then they took a program together, and then now Sandeep came to BC. He was last working at UBC. So they co-authored this book about a just transition, right? It was called Total Transition. And they looked at both India, what the transition would be needed in places like the coal belt in Jharkhand and in the Alberta tar sands, right? In the treaty territories in that area, right, where the Fort Chipewyan, where the First
Right.
Nations have been impacted so much.
Yeah.
And so they interviewed a lot of people on the ground. But I think that those kind of solutions need to be thought out in place, in context, while all this stuff is happening. But we need to sort of always go back to grounding it in specific contexts, specific places, right? So I do feel that there's hope, not just in the next generation, in my students, but also in the current generation of leaders in Indigenous communities who've looked at coming up with those solutions, right? And I think there's lots of other leaders as well around. So
For sure.
that's what we got to keep them focused on. That whenever I lose hope, I just go back to hey, people have been working on this for a long time and they're not giving up, right? So why should I?
Right.
Great.
I mean, if you give up, then the outcome is inevitable. But yeah, and First Nations around forest management as well, like cultural burns and stuff like that. They're kind of, by going back to traditional ways, they're kind of on the cutting edge.
Community controlled forests,
Yeah,
I
community
mean,
controlled
that's
forests, yeah.
absolutely important, right?
Yeah.
Because people have a stake not just in how the forest is managed for extraction, but also the watersheds, the water quality,
Yeah.
right? The habitats for animals, the traditional uses in forests, right? The non-timber uses of forests, for whether it's for berries or plants or traditional
Yeah.
medicines, ethnobotany, also tourism, right? So thinking about all of these problems in a more holistic way, I think would be a good start, right? It's very difficult in Canada because we've historically, the settler economy has been premised on extraction, right? And in my other geography classes, I always start with that, like Staples theory, right? The Harold Innis's work, right, on how the Canadian economy was so dependent. I always say like the three F's, right, and M, right, fisheries, forests, furs, right, and then mining, right. That was the original Staples economy. It was all about extraction. It was all about infinite possibilities. There was no event horizon, right? It was just simply like we could diminish in perpetuity. There was no sense of carrying capacity. Actually, if you think about it, the lack of humility, like it's actually very. I'm not a religious person, but it goes against almost all religions as well. Like doesn't show humans as being humble in any way. And so I think that that's something that the ecological movement in the age of ecology and now in the age of climate change has given us. And it's not necessarily, some people might say, oh, science is religion or something like this. It's not that. It's just another lens to remind us of our humility, right? And I think then Indigenous people often, not always, but often remind us of that as well. Like how could we have forgotten to be stewards of our place, right? Why should we, excuse the language, excuse the pun, why should we shit in our water? Like how can we live in that situation, right? So I think it goes back to that, right? Like we don't need, we all need to consume as beings, but we don't need to consume the way we have. And, and our role model shouldn't be those who are, jetting all over the place or whatever, right? I mean, I fly too, but I think that we need to just sort of try to look at our own ecological footprint as well as contextualizing that in the global footprint as well.
Yeah. And that notion of, that Indigenous notion of looking 7 generations into the future.
Intergenerational equity, yeah.
Yeah. Just that notion of, even when it comes to consumption, value, it's only ever located like in the moment. Like you build a mine, that might be a very profitable use of that land, of that resource, like in the moment, but it destroys all future uses for generations, and that is never factored into just the pure economic equation, never mind the broader one. But yes.
Right. Well, is there any other topic that we haven't addressed? This has been, I have learned
It's
a
been
lot. This
pretty
has been very inspiring. Thank you, David, for this. This has been wonderful.
Or is there
But
anything you would like to plug?
Yeah.
Well, this week we have an event.
Keeping in mind,
It may not
that-
come out
that-
for a bit. I think we can get this one out pretty fast, but
Okay. All right.
but,
All right.
but
Over to you, Greg.
Well, this event is
Yeah,
really,
that's on you then.
even if this
Yes.
event has happened in the past, when the listeners are hearing this in the past, they should be able to access the videos for it. So it is Sustainable Development Week, SDG Week, right? Sustainable Development Goals, which are sort of collective action goals from the United Nations. And we're having an event called Fire, Climate, and Community. And it's going to, we've got a really interesting panel of 4 speakers who, including John Velland, who's written this book about, a fire weather. And it's going to be on this Wednesday at the Kwantlen campus in Richmond, the Melville Center for Dialogue, right? So,
Right.
and that's going to not just include Vallant's work, but it's also going to include Melinda Lubacan Massimo, who's coming at it. I think her perspective is both from an Indigenous perspective, but also someone who's worked on environmental issues with the Suzuki Foundation. And I believe she has her own NGO now. And then there's also Eugene Kung from West Coast Environmental Law,
Right.
and Liz Tuhey from KPU, an instructor who's done painting about fire, right? So the bigger point is we're going to talk about the injustices of fire and how that is impacting communities, and maybe what are some possible solutions at a community-based level. So it's definitely about this bigger justice issue, which we talked about today. So
Right.
yeah.
Are you going to live stream it as well? Or?
I believe it is being live streamed.
Okay.
Because I know I've signed up for the registration because I'm going to run there after a class in person because I'm teaching on the other campus. But I've noticed that they have a registration for the digital portion.
Oh, they do? Okay.
Yeah, so it should be live streamed.
Because I'm teaching, but otherwise I would go.
Oh, yeah. Well, you can check out the recording then.
The
And,
recording, yeah.
probably listeners could as well. And then we also have the Climate Plus talks, which happen every Tuesday at noon. Well, not every Tuesday, but most Tuesdays at noon. So we have if you go to the Climate Plus, which is the plus sign, which is supposed to be intersectional, right? Climate Plus Challenge website, under events, it has all the links. And then for the recordings, we're posting those about a week after we've done those. So this week, the chair of our Geography and Environment Department, John Martin, is going to be talking about water and how that relates to climate change. And so he'll be talking a little bit about that issue as well. So yeah, there's always lots going on, and it's sometimes feels overwhelming. So it's better to catch the recording sometimes if you can't make it in person. Yeah.
Sure. And people can just check out the Climate Plus Challenge website for general info on what's coming up.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
And this summer I'm teaching a course called, it's the first time it's going to be taught, hopefully, Geography 2050. It's called Climate Mitigation and Adaptation Strategies.
Oh, great.
So it's a summer course. So we'll probably be doing some field trips, and it should be kind of fun, especially the first time. I find students, I like to listen to students, but I'm more attentive to what students want the first time something's being taught.
Right.
So they can have an imprint on perhaps future generations of that course as well.
All right. Yeah. So sign up for that and make your imprint.
Exactly.
All right. Well, thanks so much, David. This has been great, and we really appreciate you coming in. And
Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
This has been wonderful.
All right. Thanks.